The Rwandan-backed rebels marched into the center of the East Congo's largest city on Monday. I'm joined now by Professor Abel Esterhuyse, Associate Professor of Strategy in the Faculty of Military Science at the University of Stellenbosch. Very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. Now, the SNDF maintains that our soldiers there are peacekeepers. They are not a fighting force. Of course, that hasn't stopped 9 of our soldiers from dying.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I should say, I have over the last couple of days asked many questions as to precisely what are we doing in the DRC. And the question one has to answer and ask here whether our mission was really set up as a token mission, as a symbolic mission in a way, or whether it was really set up to protect the lives of innocent people and to be a real peace mission in the DRC. And one is sort of in doubt when you hear about South African soldiers being killed, and you are not equipped, you're not supported to respond in kind, and so this is quite a huge predicament for South Africa.
From your vantage point, Prof, why are we not equipped?
Well, I think there's a strategic answer to that question, and there's an operational answer to that question. The strategic answer to the question is simply the reality that since the 2000s, we were not really successful in South Africa aligning the defense force in personnel, in structure, and in equipment with the size of the defense budget. And I should emphasize here that it is not the budget we want to have. It is the budget we have, and we need to align the defense force in personnel, in structure, and in technology with the budget we have. We can moan, we can groan, we can ask for more and a bigger budget, but in the end, we need to make tough decisions to align the defense force with the budget we have. And that's the three variables: personnel, technology, and organization. That's the first point. The second, and this is more of an operational issue, that because we didn't align the defense force with the budget in terms of personnel, technology, and structure, we are at the moment not in a position to properly sustain any, I almost want to say, battalion to brigade size deployment into any African country. And that relates to the support to this kind of deployments in terms of air support, in terms of medical support, in terms of intelligence support, and in terms of logistical support. And this is precisely what we are witnessing at the moment, that our defense force is not able to sustain the forces over distance, especially when there's quite a lot of consumption and pressure on forces in the area of operations.
If then, Prof, there's an acknowledgement, I'm assuming there is, that you have these constraints: equipment, budgetary, technology, and other constraints, why would you expose your soldiers to a situation like what they are finding themselves in the DRC currently? In other words, you leave a comfort zone, which is a peaceful South Africa. You are exposing them to these rebels who have every reason, to fight. Why would you do that?
Yeah, that's I think the strategic question, and that's the question as to precisely what it is that we need to achieve with that deployment? In other words, and if I have to rephrase that point, what is the strategic outcome? What is the strategic effect that our government and our military decision makers wants to achieve with the deployment of this force? Is it a force that they want to use to protect the civilians? It's definitely too small to do that. What is the purpose of the force? And one has to ask that question against the background of the replacement of MONUSCO with this force, this African Union force. That was a force of almost 17,500 personnel that we replaced with a SADC force of about 5,000 people. And there was this idea that SADC will do better than the UN. The UN have been in the area for 20 years, and they were not strategically very effective in those 20 years. Of course, they have done certain things, but that mission was structured in a way that only 12,000 of that 17,000 personnel in that mission was military people. The rest was civilian people from NGOs and other entities that provided support to the civilian population. The SADC mission is not equipped to do that at all. So there is indeed quite a large question mark hanging over precisely what it is that the South African mission and the SADC mission in particular is to accomplish in the DRC.
I mean, knowing our situation, which you articulated, our capabilities, but also our shortcomings, has, as far as you know, SADC come to the party? In other words, where would you say, okay, we know that South Africans have these challenges, but we are stepping in to then make up for those shortcomings. Has that happened, or is that happening?
I think one has to be very honest here. I mean, as a SADC mission, we cannot compare and operate at the same level as a UN mission in terms of resources. We have to be, I think, frank about that and honest about that. Moreover, I'm not sure. I know that the president asked for a full contingent of about 2,000 South African military personnel, but we don't really know what the size of the South African contingent is that was deployed to the DRC. And we're not sure whether it's a full contingent. So that's a question that is sort of hanging in the air. It's one thing to say we're going to deploy 2,000 people. It's another thing to actually deploy that size of force. And then, of course, there's the question as to, it's one thing to do a deployment. It's another thing to employ the forces once they are deployed, and I'm playing with words here a little bit, but to effectively employ those forces once they are in the area of operations. And here, perhaps one has to say something about the M23 rebel force. I think the Rwandese military have trained it over quite an extensive time. They've definitely been advised by the Rwandese military. The offensive that they have undertook in the last couple of days and that unfolded, it was very sophisticated. It was a sophisticated campaign. They are well equipped. They operate drones. And more importantly, and this is quite interesting, they are winning the information battle. They are much better in communicating with the wider world in terms of what they are doing. And so they're also much better in the information domain than the SADC than the SADC forces, and that is something that one really has to consider here. It's in fact a worrisome phenomenon.
But then, I mean, taking you back where you started on the strategic questions, knowing the structure of the South African National Defence Force and its capabilities, would you vouch for their capacity to analyze the situation, taking into account all the constraints you have mentioned, and the ability to then look at a situation like the DRC, where the rebel forces have every reason and incentive to fight? Do you think that the entire structure, including, of course, the politicians who will have to sanction or approve of whatever mission, that we have what it takes to actually analyze these situations, do what is best for our country, take into account the possible consequences? And in this instance, you're talking about soldiers who have died and many who have been injured. And then out of this whole situation, are we really able to put the interests of our country first, but also the interests of those soldiers and their families? Do we have that capacity, honestly speaking?
Yeah, it's a very broad question you're asking, and I think one has to understand that there's two arguments at the moment. The one argument is the argument of DIRCO and the Foreign Affairs establishment, South African Foreign Affairs establishment. And their argument is a simple argument of we as South Africa is a hegemon in the region, we are a leading country in the region, and we as South Africans ought to be seen as taking the lead in dealing with this kind of problems in the region. I think that's the one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is, of course, the argument of capacity and the question as to whether we really have the capacity to fulfill that vision of foreign affairs. So in my opinion, and here one has to question the alignment between the foreign policy, South African foreign policy, and the South African defense policy. And I think this is at the heart of what this problem is really about, that South African foreign policy ambitions and South African foreign policy responsibilities is not reflected in the South African defense policy. And we need to find alignment between the defense policy and the foreign policy. I think that is a critical issue that government will have to look at and that they will have to resolve. I think that's the political question. The strategic question for the South African military and that the generals need to answer is whether they have deployed a military and a force that is capable to do what it is supposed to do. And I can't answer that question except to say that from the outside, the South Africans seem to be in trouble, and we find it difficult to do what needs to be done. And I should say here, Vivu, it was quite concerning for me over the weekend to see that South African forces are fighting from their base areas. In other words, they are not operating with mobility and with maneuver, dominating the terrain and trying to create freedom of maneuver for themselves, but that they are sitting and that they are fighting from their base areas. And that's a very, very troubling thing for every military leader to put your forces in a position where they have to fight from their base areas.
Oh, it is concerning. Indeed, you're fighting from your base, and the M23 says it has taken over the city of Goma. So essentially, you are surrounded. Prof, let me thank you very much for your time and insights. Really appreciate it.